You're listening to Leadership Loading, a podcast that inspires leaders to be continuous learners and provides insight for those making the leap from the front line to the boardroom. My name is Jason McLaren, and I'm an Air Force firefighter veteran and safety expert turned entrepreneur and nonprofit director. I'm sitting down with industry leaders to talk about their leadership traits and lessons they have learned that can make an impact on future leaders. Hey everybody, my name is Jason McLaren, host for Leadership Loading Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. He's an organizational psychologist and best-selling author. Benjamin, Dr. Hardy, thanks for coming on the show today.
Of course. Happy to be with you.
Great. So you focus a lot on the myths of personality and how that can affect us when we're trying to work on our career field.
Yeah. I mostly just focus on how people's incorrect and limiting views of their own personality stop them from creating the life that they really want and lead them to pursuing lesser goals and creating a lesser life than they would ultimately choose for themselves.
Great. And can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just give a little bit of background. So I have a PhD in organizational psychology, which is essentially the study of leadership, teams, motivation, organizational dynamics, stuff like that. I got that from Clemson University, completed my PhD last year. During the first year of my PhD program, my wife and I became foster parents of 3 kids who ultimately, over a 3-year process, we were able to fight the legal system or the foster system in court and ultimately adopt our 3 kids. And that was in February of 2018. And a month after we adopted our kids, my wife got pregnant, which is slightly cliche, but she got pregnant with twins who were born in December of 2018. And so actually in 2018, while still doing my PhD, ultimately had 5 kids, 0 to 5 in 1 year, which was crazy. From a more professional perspective, while I was in my PhD program, I started blogging online and became the #1 writer in the world on medium.com for 3 years and was able to become a professional writer. So I've published a book called Willpower Doesn't Work. And my new book, Personality Isn't Permanent, comes out in 2020. So it's been a fun ride. And I'm always challenged and humbled by what I'm up to, and always just learning more about how we can have more meaning and success in our lives.
Definitely, and we'll talk a little bit more about the book in a minute. I can kind of resonate with that adoption story. My wife and I were having trouble conceiving, and she had some medical issues, and the doctor said you probably won't be able to have kids. So we started that adoption process, going through all the classes here in Texas, and Lord willing, we were blessed with pregnancy on our 2nd month of classes, and so kind of the same. Not 5 kids. We've got our 1, and we're happy with that for now. And maybe look at adoption in a little bit, but how is that, working with 5 kids? Do you mind sharing their ranges and age ranges and that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the older 3 that we adopted are now 12, 10, and 8. And then our twins now at this point are, at the point of this recording, like 14 months old. So it's crazy, man. It's fun. I wouldn't be able to do it if I didn't have an amazing wife. We wouldn't even have an interest or desire to do it if it wasn't kind of relevant to our more spiritual perspectives and kind of our higher level purpose in life. We wouldn't do stuff like this. But as I talk about, personality isn't permanent. Your purpose actually should trump your personality, and your purpose can transform your personality, because having a purpose in life and you ultimately choosing to find that for yourself leads you to doing things beyond what is comfortable, or leading you beyond things that you think are native or natural to yourself. You can expand and grow way beyond. I think the typical perspective of personality is it leads people to avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure, just doing what's comfortable and what we would call natural to them. But when you start to kind of live beyond that kind of low level form of thinking and start to pursue higher pursuits, higher, more noble, purposes, you become a lot more flexible in how you see yourself. You're a lot more willing to engage in difficult things. Just as an example, like admittedly, the first year or so of being a foster parent, I did not like it. It was actually more my wife's desire than mine initially.
Yeah.
And I would say I was a terrible parent, not because I didn't have the capacity, but more just because I didn't have the desire. It wasn't really, I was supporting my wife in it, but I had to ultimately come to grips with it. And it was tough, dude. I mean, in the beginning, they were tough, and we had no clue what we were doing. You know, they had a lot of behavioral challenges and emotional difficulties and trauma, and we had to deal with a lot of stuff. And I had to learn to invest in them. And I think that's a big aspect of personality. Honestly, is what you invest in. You become what you invest in. And I had to learn to invest in them and spend time with them and learn to care about them, learn to love them, and learn to kind of develop a vision of myself as a parent. And as I did that and kind of shifted my identity on that, I was able to kind of, learn to really enjoy that and have it become a really meaningful purpose and aspect of my life. So I love it. And it's really pushed me and forced me and my wife to change in many different ways and become better people, I think. So it's very purposeful and meaningful. And I recommend it to anyone who, feels called to that or has that sense of wanting to do something meaningful.
All right, let's jump into your book. So can we talk a little bit about your first book?
That book is about how if you want to really make changes in your life, willpower is a very slow, ineffective, and inconsistent approach. Willpower is kind of an individualistic way of looking at life where you put all the pressure on yourself to succeed. And a much better, more effective approach is by changing your environment. Environment is far more powerful from a psychological perspective than willpower. You'll see over and over if you actually study psychology that human beings, they generally tend to become the product of their environment or their context. Now, the more kind of intentional and thoughtful you become, the more you design your own environment to help you become the person you want to be. So one application of willpower doesn't work is obviously eliminating aspects of your environment that are keeping you stuck. Learning to develop systems and things like that for eliminating phone addiction, food addiction, lame media, just distractions in general. The other application, though, which is just as compelling, is proactively putting yourself in environments and situations above your current self. So one example would be me and my wife creating an environment where we're parents, putting ourselves in a situation where we're required, not through willpower, but because of the situation, to evolve, to learn, to become. So there's a quote from the historian Will Durant, and he said, "The ability of the average person could be doubled if the situation demanded it." So not only do you want to create situations that demand or force you to, show up in ways above and beyond what you're currently doing, but you want to surround yourself in situations where you're around people who remind you more of your future than your past. So putting yourself in situations where you can quickly learn and absorb and emulate and become and collaborate with people who are far advanced to you, whether that be in fitness, whether that be financially, just putting yourself in the right situations. So that's what willpower doesn't work is all about. And it's very strategic on how to do that.
Definitely. I was just looking at I was on LinkedIn looking at one of my people I follow. He's a senior enlisted advisor for the Air Force. And like you said, putting yourself around people that are going to look towards your future. And he had a quote on there. It said, if you want to soar with the eagles, don't hang around with the turkeys. And I think that's a more military mindset of, hanging around with people that are going to set you up for success. So that's good.
Yep. So it takes, I wrote the book because there's a lot of people in my life who have genuine potential and genuine desires to improve their life, but they put all the pressure on themselves and their willpower is never enough. And so as a result, they keep falling back into old patterns because they keep themselves in the same situation, around the same people, around the social network. And once you become committed to change, you stop playing that game and you start, rather than kind of being in a situation where you're swimming up current, you put yourself in an environment where the water's pushing or pulling you forward the direction you want to go. So yeah, in psychology, there's two different types of motivation. One being push, where you have to push yourself to do something you don't ultimately want to do, or you're pushing and fighting against like a situation or environment. The other one is pull motivation, where you're getting pulled forward by a situation and also by a future that you want. So it takes less willpower and ultimately it becomes intrinsic. It becomes exciting, but also the situation pulls it out of you, demands it out of you. And so I became sick of watching people fail and blame themselves. I mean, and I wanted to show kind of a more honest approach that, look, if you're going to make this change, you're going to have to change your environment. You can't make permanent change by keeping things the way they are.
So that kind of ties into your new book, Personality Isn't Permanent. So what are I think this kind of resonates with me. How does the subconscious impact your personality? I think that's one that resonated with me when I was looking over the book information.
Yeah. So in the book, I identify 4 what I call levers of personality. So just to give a little bit of background, and then I'll talk about the subconscious. Generally, personality is defined as a person's consistent attitudes and traits or habits or behaviors. It's just how you consistently show up in various situations. And most people come to think that their personality is their true and authentic self, who they really are. And people often show up in pretty consistent ways. I think we tend to see that. My question in the book was why? Why do people show up consistently? Is it because their personality is innate? And the answer was no. I mean, I was able to see that myself, but the research is very clear that personality changes over time, whether you're intentional or not. Personality is very flexible, and it's more based on your context or your situation, and it's also based on your emotional development as a person. So trauma is one of the 4 levers. Trauma is one of the things that keeps people stuck in the past and basically in repetitive cycles. Your identity narrative, basically the story that you use to explain yourself, is another one of those levers. Your identity and how you see yourself and how you define yourself keeps you viewing yourself, the world, and acting in similar ways. Your subconscious is another one of those levers, as is your environment. But your subconscious is essentially, it's where you're at the deeper core self. Your subconscious is like your beliefs, but it's also your addiction. So 95% of our behavior happens subconsciously. As a simple example, you're breathing right now without thinking about it. When you drive and when you develop habits, you kind of outsource your behavior to your subconscious. Just as an example, driving. Like once you get proficient at driving, you can kind of do it without even thinking about it. And that's in a lot of ways what personality becomes for people. It becomes just a subconscious play-by-play repeating loop. And there's a really good quote from Dr. David Hawkins. He was a really important guy, but he basically said that the unconscious, which is another word for subconscious, but your unconscious will only allow you to have what you believe you deserve. So basically, the results you're getting in your life, the success, the amount of money, the quality of relationships you have, all of that is more a reflection of your subconscious, system, or your subconscious belief system. And subconscious is also kind of the emotional level that you're at as a person. So if you're someone, for example, who is used to fearing things, then your subconscious is mostly operating in fear. And you'll have to upgrade and retrain how you emotionally approach life in order to upgrade your subconscious. And there's obviously ways to do that. Courageous actions and behaviors, gratitude obviously can reshift the emotional climate of your life. There's powerful ways to upgrade your subconscious, but as you engage in what I call subconscious enhancing behaviors and experiences, your identity shifts and you begin to attract or just like expect and see better outcomes in your life. You begin to believe you deserve more. So you begin to believe and have the confidence to pursue things that are above your current self. So subconscious is huge.
Yeah.
And you can actively invest in your subconscious. You can aggressively enhance and improve it. And there is very specific strategies for how you can adjust and improve your subconscious.
Awesome. And you talked about trauma. Are you talking about like all traumas or just like psychological or physical?
In this case, mostly psychological. I think that in often cases they are connected. But trauma is really defined as any negative, in this case, mostly let's talk emotional, but in this, it's any negative experience that you internalize, identify with, and then ultimately you avoid it. You stop it. It stops you from moving forward. So there's a lot of research that talks about how trauma creates what's called a frozen personality, and basically it traps you in your past. And rather than resolving and reframing what happened to you, whatever it was, and trauma is not just huge stuff. Trauma is any experience that kind of shapes how you view yourself in a limiting way. So if someone says you're ugly, and you actually like believe it, that would be a trauma. Like if it impacts and limits your future, and it keeps you kind of absorbed in what happened. Any negative experience that you don't move on from is traumatic. And what trauma does is it keeps you stuck in the past, but it also shatters your confidence and eliminates your imagination. So that's one of the big things that research has found, is that trauma, especially people with, like, let's just say extreme PTSD, they've done a lot of psychological tests on these people, and they have almost no imagination. And trauma is kind of defined as emotional rigidity. You're rigid, you're locked in, you're black and white. You're not flexible. It's the opposite of becoming flexible. And flexibility is essential for learning. It's essential for imagining a different future. It's essential for reshaping your identity. So what the research shows in so many different areas is that, you know, your ability to, let's just say, imagine a future self, some different version of you with different characteristics, different freedom, different situation, different capacity, maybe a different daily, your ability to imagine a future self and actually believe in it is dependent on your imagination and your psychological flexibility. The amount of trauma, you have that's unresolved, that you haven't dealt with, the less ability you have to do that, the more of a fixed mindset you have, and the more you just believe you are who you are and that life is the way it is. You become black and white in your thinking, which is rigidity. And you don't imagine and create a desired future self. And you overly define yourself by the past, not the future. And in order to become someone new, you've got to, and even to engage in what's called deliberate practice, you've got to imagine a future self with the skills that you're striving to create in your life. So vision or imagination is key to engaging in a process that will help you become who you want to become. And, basically what the research shows is that people don't spend very much time imagining their future self, defining their future self, and then actively engaging in behaviors that their future self would do, and kind of shifting their identity story to their future self rather than their former self. So there's many things you can do to begin defining who you want to be, and then actively and aggressively acting in the way that would be. And if you actively and aggressively acted as your future self rather than your former self, you would shift and upgrade your subconscious, because you'd be creating emotional experiences, sometimes very courageous experiences. Sometimes it's scary. Just as an example, if you want to be someone who's in shape, but you're completely unhealthy. One of the stories I tell in the book is of a guy who I saw running near my neighborhood, and he was totally overweight. And he was running outside. I live in Florida, with his shirt off. And this guy had stretch marks, totally flabby, and he wasn't paying any attention to any of the people driving past him. He was just totally focused on what he was doing. And obviously, from my perspective, that probably took a huge amount of courage. But that's him acting from the perspective he wants to, from his future self perspective. And that's courageous. And that would be what I would call a subconscious enhancing experience or behavior.
All right. And for the listeners that may have experienced these traumas like PTSD you mentioned, and maybe traumatic brain injury, what are the key ways that we can transform that trauma?
Yeah. So there's a book called Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma by Peter Levine. He's one of the top trauma experts in the world. Bessel van der Kolk is another one of the top trauma experts in the world. He wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. One of the things that Peter Levine says, which is incredibly important, is that trauma is not what happens to you. It's what you hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So again, we're mostly talking about emotional experiences right here. I mean, obviously physical stuff matters too, but if you have a physical injury, obviously you're going to have to reframe your identity, and you're going to have to explain what happened. And you've got to learn to explain the situation in a strategic and in a positive way. And so you've got to be able to, at some point or another, you'll know the trauma is healed if you explain the story as that whatever happened to you happened for you, not to you. If you still believe that whatever happened to you whatever happened to you, and that you're the kind of the victim of whatever occurred, then you're still blaming it. But eventually, at some point, you realize that everything is happening for you. So, basically, going back to the quote from Peter Levine, he said, "Trauma isn't what happens to you; it's what you hold inside." In the absence of an empathetic witness. And so ultimately one of the crucial things you must do, because trauma by nature, especially emotional trauma that shapes your, traps you in the past and stops you from imagining and becoming flexible, is that it's isolated and it's private. There's a quote that says you're as sick as your secrets. That's the Alcoholics Anonymous statement. And at this point, the research is pretty clear that addiction is more the byproduct of trauma than anything else. It's a coping mechanism to deal with the pain or to avoid kind of facing the bitter truths. And so the thing you've got to do is courageously start to communicate to other people, to an empathetic witness in a safe environment, what you're dealing with. Journaling is a really powerful way to reframe trauma, to start to just kind of dump it out on paper, to see it, rethink it, review it. But getting other people in your life, this could be a therapist, but it could be a friend, it could be a coach, a mentor, essentially anyone where you can just totally open up and honestly share how you felt and how this experience has impacted you. And then ultimately starting to rethink how you want to view it. One thing that's really important is that memory is flexible. Memory is not a file cabinet. How you view your past is basically a reflection of where you're currently at as a person. We always reconstruct our past and our memories based on where we currently are as a person. So the idea is that memory changes. Memory is flexible, and actually the best thing that could happen for you is for your memories to expand and change. As you go through life, as you go through experiences, and as you learn and, become someone new, you start to reimagine or recontextualize your former experiences. They start to have new and different meaning for you. And so that's healthy. It's healthy to reframe your memories, to kind of reimagine them, and you do that proactively. You do that intentionally. First, you just start by kind of getting clear on what happened rather than avoiding it. But then over time, you get better at strategically explaining your narrative, explaining what happened. One thing I would say, one other thing that's important, especially if a trauma involved other people, is to, if possible, if they're still alive, creating a dialogue with that person. If they're not, you've got to kind of come to some different version. You've got to kind of reframe your relationship with that person. But as an example, my father, when I grew up, and I tell the story in the book, became a very heavy drug addict when I was in junior high and high school. My parents' divorce led him to being in a tough place. And for a long time, I really didn't like my dad because of who he was and the impact of his behavior on me. And ultimately, over time, I've come to kind of readdress the past and readdress the situation. I ended up serving a church mission for a few years, and that led me to kind of thinking about him and his situation differently. Going through a full PhD in psychology and understanding, human psyche and behavior led me to kind of having a little bit more empathy towards my father. Also, adopting 3 kids. My father was adopted, and also my father is no longer a drug addict. He has changed his life, and he's helped a lot of people, as an addiction counselor. And so the further and further away you get from an experience, and also not avoiding it, dealing with it. There's a concept in psychology called exposure therapy. You expose yourself to something enough that it stops being novel or emotional, and it just starts to become information that you can then use or not use. And I've had many conversations with my dad about those experiences in our lives, and gotten his perspective on what he was dealing with. And that's allowed me to reframe how I view my dad and how I even review and view that former period of my life. I now definitely believe that all that stuff happened for me, not to me. So that's some stuff you could do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have some kind of trauma, whether it be the parent.
We all do.
Whether it be the parent or the military or something like that. So with that, as leaders, how can we redesign? And this will be the final question before we move on into the closure. But with that, how can we redesign our environment effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step of leadership is vision. You can't be a leader without a vision. Like, where would you lead people? What would you do? And so becoming explicit and clear and defining what you want. That's kind of step one to being a leader of yourself and other people, is defining a compelling future and a specific goal. Then it's about getting the right people who are also interested in that same future, or who would be impacted positively by being a part of that process, and helping them obviously be a part of that in a positive way. So that could be, honestly, it doesn't have to be business. My wife and I, as an example, like, we have a shared vision, and we had to kind of know what we wanted in order to find the right people and even to lead our family. Like, we have to kind of have a sense of vision or purpose. And so whether it be business, family, you've got to be clear, and you got to be able to communicate what you want and why it's important in order to attract the right people to become a part of that. People are really attracted to purpose. They're attracted to becoming a part of something meaningful and important. And they want a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. And we as humans don't always have to be the leader. Sometimes we can be a person who joins someone else's cause. We can have different roles and dimensions in our lives. We're not one dimensional. So you can simultaneously be leading a project or a vision or a cause at the same time you are a part of someone else's vision or cause. And in that sense, you're attracted to what they're trying to accomplish, or you see potential as to being a part of that would impact positively your life or development. So I think first step is clarifying and defining the future, and then being able to adequately explain what it is and why it's so important. And I think that's kind of crucial to then attracting the right people, removing the people who are keeping you stuck or that would hold you back. So I think that's pretty key. And I find personally, there's a really good book called Vivid Vision by Cameron Herold, but I find that people are not that explicit about what they truly want. They're not that honest about their true goals and intentions. They tend to downplay or speak in the terms of abstract. They're not like radically clear about saying, this is what I want to accomplish, and this is why I believe it's so important. I think that is leadership. And the more you do that in the different areas of your life, the more you will attract the right people and eliminate the wrong people.
Definitely. All right, so how can the listeners find out more about you or get into your other things other than your books?
They're happy, and they're more than welcome to read my blog posts if they want. My blogs have been read by over 100 million people, but I would challenge people to read the books. I think that's probably the best contribution I could make to your audience. Those are by far my most impactful works. I spend a lot more time writing books than I do writing blog posts. And so obviously, benjaminhardy.com, feel free to read any of the blog posts. But if any of this resonated, check out Willpower Doesn't Work. But I would actually say Personality Isn't Permanent is by far a more dense and deeper and more transformational book.
Yeah, and I look forward to reading it. Hard copies come out on June 16th.
Book comes out on June 16th. Yep.
Well, thanks, Dr. Hardy. Like I said, go check out his website, benjaminhardy.com, and go to Amazon and check out the book. And Personality Isn't Permanent, Breaking Free from Your Self-Limiting Beliefs and Rewriting Your Story. Anything else, Dr. Hardy?
Cool, man. No, absolutely not. Thank you guys for listening, and have an incredible day.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Loading Podcast. You can support this podcast on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/leadershiploading to get access to exclusive content, chats, and a whole lot more. Again, that's patreon.com/leadershiploading, or visit our website, leadershiploading.com, for more options.